When the dock at Puerto Banus became an arena of public humiliation, the high society crowd believed they were watching a woman's quiet defeat. Under the blazing noon sun, glass flutes of champagne sparkled, linen suits caught the sea breeze, and high-end cameras lined the pier for the reveal of Ferrer Hospitality's newest 48-meter mega yacht. Elena Marquez was led to the third row by a visibly uncomfortable protocols staffer who whispered that the seating plan had been changed at the last minute by the communications director. From that third row, Elena watched her husband, Alvaro Ferrer, step onto the primary stage holding the arm of Valeria Cruz. Valeria wore an ivory designer dress far too reminiscent of a wedding gown, waving to photographers with the absolute confidence of someone who already considered herself the mistress of the domain. Alvaro, looking pristine in a slate blue suit, never looked at his wife once. When he took the microphone, he spoke of bold corporate expansion and surrounding oneself with inspiring visionaries, before sliding a hand around Valeria's waist to claim that the project would have had no heart without her. The white canvas covering the bow fell away to enthusiastic applause, revealing bold golden letters, Valeria. The name was so large it read like a declaration of war. Whispers rippled through the gathering, punctuated by the frantic clicking of press cameras. Alvaro offered a broad, triumphant smile, while Valeria cupped a hand over her chest in an expression of carefully rehearsed emotion. Elena did not look away. Near the gangway, she spotted a small metal plaque displaying the transaction's registration number, the exact same financial tracking code she had seen 6 months earlier on the paperwork for Project Aurora. That single detail confirmed her deepest suspicion. There was no second corporate yacht, no parallel investment, and no administrative mix-up. The extravagant gift presented to her husband's mistress had been bought using a massive loan secured against the historic commercial building Elena had inherited from her late father. Alvaro then called Elena up to the stage with a wide, performative smile, using a tone that suggested he was doing her a great favor. He announced to the crowd that his wife had always supported the company's growth, and that he wanted her to share this moment of corporate unity. It was a calculated trap. If Elena refused to join them, he would portray her as a bitter, jealous woman, unable to separate personal feelings from business. If she accepted, the photographs would show a wife publicly legitimizing in tribute to her husband's lover. Elena stood up and walked steadily toward the stage, taking her time while dozens of smartphone cameras followed her every step. When she reached the platform, Alvaro leaned in to kiss her cheek, but she turned her head just enough so the gesture was missed, visible only to him. Valeria held out a bottle of champagne, tied with a gold ribbon, offering her a glass. Elena did not take it. Instead, she looked directly at the bottle and asked in a calm, clear voice if they had received the final launch authorization from the lender. For a fraction of a second, Alvaro lost his composure. He quickly forced a smile and replied that all permits were fully in order, that the group's legal team had worked on it for weeks, and that this was hardly the time to bore their guests with technical details. Valeria laughed lightly and raised the bottle toward the hull, but Elena extended a hand and gently caught the ribbon before the bottle could swing. There was no struggle or shouting, just a deliberate gesture that brought the entire ceremony to a dead stop. Then, Elena spoke the words that paralyzed the entire pier. Before breaking that bottle, she said, Valeria should take a very close look at whose signature paid for the ship carrying her name. The silence across the marina was absolute. Alvaro stepped closer, keeping his smile fixed for the cameras, and whispered fiercely that she was making a fool of herself. Elena calmly unzipped her leather bag, pulled out a gray folder, and set it directly onto the podium. On the cover was the logo of the investment bank, alongside the official loan file for Project Aurora. Valeria took half a step back, though she tried to keep her chin up. Alvaro slammed the folder shut and announced to the crowd that his wife was going through a difficult emotional phase due to her mother's illness, leading to a tragic misunderstanding of private corporate matters. The cruelty was surgical, using her mother's declining health to publicly discredit her sanity. He then signaled the band to resume playing and urged protocol staff to proceed. Nobody moved. Two black sedans had just pulled up at the entrance of the pier. From them stepped Thomas Aguirre, the head of private banking, accompanied by a legal officer, 3 compliance executives, and 2 port security officers. Thomas bypassed Alvaro entirely, walked up the stage, displayed his official credentials, and announced that, by order of the financing institution, the final loan disbursement was suspended, the delivery authorization revoked, and any attempt to operate the vessel strictly prohibited. The champagne bottle slipped from Valeria's hands, though a quick staff member caught it before it shattered on the wood. Alvaro demanded an explanation, shouting that a bank could not unilaterally halt a fully executed contract. Thomas replied calmly that the institution could and would act when there were reasonable grounds to suspect documentation fraud, concealment of the true beneficiary, and a material breach of the loan's terms. At a nod from the bank's attorney, port security officers sealed off the gangway and placed an official notice across the primary access point. The photographers lowered their focus from Valeria and turned their lenses onto Alvaro, whose triumphant expression disintegrated into raw panic. 6 months earlier, a steady rain had washed over the city as Alvaro placed a dark blue folder onto the breakfast table. Elena had barely slept 4 hours a night for 3 days straight because her mother had just undergone major surgery and required constant presence at the clinic. Alvaro waited for the housekeeper to leave the kitchen, poured 2 cups of coffee, and adopted the warm, gentle tone he always used when he needed something difficult to refuse. He explained that Ferrer Hospitality had been invited into a major alliance with several high-end coastal resorts and urgently needed a corporate vessel to host executive meetings, private dinners, and prospective investors. The initiative, code-named Project Aurora, was projected to double the company's valuation in under 5 years. Elena listened carefully, though one specific line gave her pause. The bank required an additional real estate guarantee, and the board refused to pledge core operational assets. Alvaro reached across the table, took her hand, and said that she was the only person he trusted to secure the single most important opportunity of their lives. Elena knew the true history of that trust. 15 years earlier, when Alvaro was running a struggling event planning firm, she had taken out a mortgage on her own inherited apartment to cover his payroll. Later, she introduced him to wealthy investors who respected her family's long-standing reputation, helping him acquire the hotel chain's very first property. She had never asked to be featured in press interviews or listed on commemorative plaques. She had simply believed they were building a life together. But the property Alvaro was now asking to pledge as collateral was entirely different. It was a prime commercial office building in an upscale business district that her father had left to her with a moral request: never risk it to feed someone else's ambition. Elena recalled her father's advice as she leafed through the proposed contract. The document described the yacht strictly as a commercial asset, establishing clear revenue projections, charter schedules, and explicit restrictions against personal use. Alvaro assured her that independent attorneys had thoroughly reviewed every line, and that her actual financial risk was negligible. Elena closed the folder without signing and told him clearly that she did not want this vessel to turn into another vanity project for corporate egos. Alvaro smiled, replying that he was buying a business tool, not a toy, even joking that if he ever tried to name the ship after another woman, she had his full permission to sink it before it ever left the dock. The dark irony would prove unbearable months later, but that morning she only saw the man she had shared half her life with. When she asked why the company couldn't simply wait another year, Alvaro claimed that competitors were moving fast and that missing the window would force him to lay off hard-working staff, a calculated exaggeration designed to make her feel responsible for innocent people losing their jobs. She asked for 24 hours to consult her financial advisor. Alvaro agreed, but that very afternoon he showed up at the hospital with a large bouquet of flowers for his mother-in-law, carrying a simplified version of the guarantee contract ready for signature. Elena signed it in a sterile waiting room while a nurse was calling her name to discuss her mother's test results. Alvaro embraced her, swore she would never regret trusting him, and tucked the signed paper into his coat with a speed that felt unsettling only in hindsight. Over the following weeks, he shared optimistic progress reports and photos from the shipyard. Soon, however, his answers grew vague. He claimed meetings were getting overly technical, that she needed to focus on her mother, and that there was no point in burdening her with minor updates. When she asked for digital access to the project folder, she discovered her login credentials had been revoked, an issue Alvaro brushed off as a routine system security update. Despite being locked out of the project files, Elena still maintained access to their joint personal account. There, she eventually noticed small, fragmented transfers paid out to obscure vendors. A boutique interior design firm had received direct personal funds, even though the original budget stated all furnishings were fully covered by the commercial loan. Another payment was sent to an upscale custom jeweler in a resort town. Elena meticulously noted every reference number and requested copies of the line item receipts. 2 days later, a misdirected courier package addressed to Alvaro arrived at the house. Inside was a detailed blueprint for the primary cabin's entrance plaque, reading, "For Valeria, the woman who taught me to live without asking for permission." Below the text was her husband's clear signature. Elena felt a sharp, suffocating pressure in her chest. But the most painful realization was not just the infidelity. It was discovering that Alvaro planned to turn his betrayal into a public celebration underwritten by her inheritance. She photographed every document, carefully resealed the envelope, and placed it back where she found it. From that moment forward, every polite smile she gave her husband became a deadbolt sliding into place. A week later, the official invitation to the launch ceremony arrived. Printed on heavy cardstock, it featured the vessel's silhouette against a sunset, declaring the dawn of a new era for the company. Valeria's name was prominently displayed as the project's inspiration, while Elena's name appeared at the very bottom of the general guest list. Alvaro returned home after midnight that evening and found her sitting in the living room with the invitation resting on her lap. He made no attempt to conceal his satisfaction, telling her that he expected her to behave impeccably because major lenders, press outlets, and foreign partners would be in attendance. Elena asked directly if the ship was still registered as a commercial asset of Ferrer Hospitality. Alvaro confirmed it was, though he avoided eye contact. She then asked why it bore Valeria's name. He let out a dismissive laugh, explaining that names did not denote legal ownership. They were merely marketing tools, and that she needed to stop thinking like a jealous wife if she wanted to remain part of his world. Elena held his gaze and asked what would happen if she simply chose not to attend. Alvaro walked over, leaned heavily against the arm of her chair, and said that her absence would prove to everyone that she was no longer capable of keeping up with the life he had built. He added that after the launch, they could quietly discuss a discreet separation without public drama, complete with what he called a reasonable financial settlement. The word settlement revealed how completely he had rewritten their history. He viewed himself as the sole architect of their wealth, and Elena as a dependent to be honorably dismissed. She asked if he also intended to keep her father's building when the loan came due. Alvaro replied smoothly that no guarantee would ever be executed as long as she didn't do anything irrational. He then kissed her forehead, a gesture of condescending superiority, and went upstairs, entirely unaware that Elena's phone had been recording the entire conversation from inside her purse. The next morning, Elena met with her longtime attorney, Lucia Navarro, outside the city. She provided no details over the phone, stating only that she needed an urgent review of a real estate guarantee, several suspicious bank transfers, and a digital signature that may have been misused. Before leaving the house, Elena opened an old corporate email account she still kept on a tablet and found an automated notification sent weeks prior. The designated operating entity for Project Aurora had been changed to a newly formed company called Mediterranean Lifestyle Charters. A quick search of the new entity's corporate filings revealed its sole manager was Valeria's older brother. Every piece of the puzzle suddenly fell into place. The mega yacht was never intended to serve fairer hospitality. Once launched, it was to be leased out to an entity controlled by his mistress, while the underlying debt and property risk remained pinned to Elena's personal asset. Elena closed the screen, placed her documents into a simple gray folder, and knew she could not try to stop the ceremony prematurely. She had to let Alvaro reach that stage, completely convinced that he had already won. 6 months later at Puerto Banús, that same gray folder sat open on the podium while bank officials sealed off the vessel. Alvaro was still desperately trying to convince the crowd that the situation was a temporary administrative error, but his voice lacked all conviction. Elena looked up at the golden letters on the bow and felt no thrill of victory, only a profound sorrow for the woman she had been when she signed those papers in a hospital hallway, genuinely believing she was protecting her family's future. Thomas asked Elena to step aside to formalize her statement, but she requested a brief moment first. She walked over to Valeria, who was still clutching the champagne bottle as if it were a life raft, and told her softly that the ship had never been a gift of devotion. It was just a massive debt hidden beneath expensive paint. Valeria looked at Alvaro as though seeing him clearly for the very first time. Elena stepped down from the platform as shouting erupted behind her. The launch was officially cancelled, but Alvaro's real downfall was only beginning. The day after Elena had signed the original paperwork at the clinic, she had woken up with the lingering sense that she had left something vital in a room she could no longer access. Alvaro had left early for the office, leaving a short note on the counter thanking her for her trust, alongside a small jewelry box containing diamond earrings she had never expressed any desire for. Over the years, her husband's gift-giving had followed a transparent rule. The larger the decision he made without consulting her, the more expensive the item he brought home to soften the blow. Yet Elena had forced her doubts down, telling herself that the investment would protect jobs and secure the livelihoods of hundreds of families. In those early weeks, Project Aurora seemed to move forward exactly as promised. Alvaro sent glossy updates from the shipyard and spoke enthusiastically about private charters and resort partnerships. Elena even compiled a detailed list of potential corporate clients, but when she presented it, Alvaro politely set the papers aside and said the marketing team was taking a different approach. Shortly after, she noticed she had been removed from the internal email group. Alvaro blamed an IT system migration and promised her access would be restored, though it never was. It was a subtle exclusion, but it aligned with a steady pattern of pushing her out of the business she had helped establish. Valeria Cruz had entered their lives with the ease of someone who already knew the terrain. Alvaro introduced her at a charity gala as the new communications director hired to modernize the company's image. When Valeria shook Elena's hand, she remarked how much she admired Elena's discretion, a word that sounded less like a compliment and more like an assignment. Throughout dinner, Valeria sat next to Alvaro, corrected his media answers, and finished his sentences with an easy familiarity. Over the following months, Valeria began appearing in photos taken at the shipyard. In one picture, she wore a custom white hard hat while resting her hand on the ship's railing as if inspecting her own property. In the background, Alvaro watched her with an expression Elena recognized instantly. It was the exact same look he had given Elena years ago when they had nothing and every idea felt like a shared promise. When Elena asked why a communications manager was overseeing technical vessel decisions, Alvaro claimed she was coordinating the overall brand launch, adding that Elena was misinterpreting a standard working relationship because she was exhausted from caring for her mother. It was a calculated deflection. Whenever she raised a valid question, he weaponized her mother's illness or her supposed emotional fatigue to frame reasonable inquiry as irrational paranoia. Elena tried to focus her energy on her mother, Teresa, who was undergoing intensive physical therapy. Teresa was a sharp woman who had run businesses alongside her late husband, and she quickly sensed her daughter was carrying a heavy burden. She asked point-blank if Alvaro was running into financial trouble. Elena claimed everything was fine, but Teresa reminded her that the commercial building was not just a valuable property. It was the last asset her father had explicitly kept outside the Ferrer corporate umbrella, because he never fully trusted Alvaro's endless need to prove he was the most powerful man in the room. The first concrete financial irregularity surfaced on their joint bank statement, a $48,000 transfer to a luxury interior firm based in Marbella. Elena cross-referenced the name against Project Aurora's official budget and found no trace of it. 2 days later, another $19,000 payment went out to a custom textile manufacturer. When questioned, Alvaro claimed these were design adjustments approved by the team that would be reconciled later. Elena reminded him that the guarantee agreement strictly prohibited using personal funds for asset modifications without bank notification. Alvaro snapped, accusing her of confusing accounting formalities with high-level business execution, adding that he couldn't stall a multi-million-dollar project over every curtain or glassware order. Elena did not argue further. Instead, she downloaded every transaction record and saved them into a password-protected file. A few days later, a courier delivered a parcel to the house from the interior firm. Finding the envelope unsealed, Elena opened it to find an itemized invoice for the master suite. Exotic wood paneling, custom monogrammed linens, a custom vanity, and a refrigerated cosmetic cabinet. A note at the bottom specified that all elements had to adhere to the personal preferences of Miss Valeria Cruz. Attached was a second sheet featuring a gold logo monogram, VC, designed for the bath towels, glass doors, and dressing room. This was not brand strategy. It was the meticulous construction of a private sanctuary for his mistress. Elena photographed every page and returned the papers to the envelope. That night, Alvaro dined at home for the first time in a week, acting unusually attentive as if sensing a shift. When Elena casually asked if the yacht would have assigned quarters for corporate executives, he insisted all suites were modular and flexible. When she mentioned that some companies customized master cabins for specific directors, he laughed and said it would be absurd to turn a commercial vessel into a personal residence. Elena watched him cut his steak without looking up. She didn't need a confession. The lie was plain in the perfection of his denial. Before dinner ended, his phone buzzed. He glanced down and smiled. Elena caught a glimpse of a white heart icon next to Valeria's name. From that point on, Elena investigated everything in silence. She pulled corporate registry filings, tracked vendors, and cross-referenced actual expenditures against approved bank budgets. She discovered that payments had been deliberately broken into smaller amounts to bypass internal controls, and several contracts bore the finance director's signature on dates he was out of the country. She also found receipts for a luxury jeweler, an event coordinator, and a private high-seas catering firm, none of which appeared in the proposal submitted to the bank. However, she still lacked definitive proof that Alvaro intended to hand full operational control of the vessel over to Valeria. She needed the complete picture before taking action, knowing that if she confronted him too early, he would alter contracts, erase files, and use his influence to paint her as unstable. While Elena gathered evidence, Alvaro worked to isolate her further. During a family dinner, he announced that the board had approved a corporate restructuring, claiming that to prevent conflicts of interest, Elena would no longer receive operational updates as long as her building remained tied as collateral. He framed the move as a protective measure for her, while in reality, it left her carrying all the financial risk with zero oversight. When Elena requested to attend the upcoming board meeting as a shareholder, Alvaro replied that her presence would be viewed as improper pressure. His brother supported the decision, suggesting Elena focus her efforts on the family's charitable foundation instead. Elena accepted the exile without argument. The more secure they felt, the less careful they were around her. Valeria took full advantage of Elena's absence, stepping into an increasingly public role. She appeared in lifestyle magazines alongside Alvaro, attended private dinners with key investors, and moved into a spacious corner office on the executive floor. In one interview, she stated that Ferrer Hospitality needed to shed outdated family traditions to become a truly global brand. Though she didn't mention Elena by name, the implication was clear. Days later, at a hotel opening, Valeria wore a custom designer suit that Elena had ordered months earlier from an Italian atelier. Alvaro claimed it was a sheer coincidence, even though the piece was one of a kind. Elena later learned her husband had personally picked up the garment from the atelier and presented it to Valeria. This theft of personal items felt almost more sinister than the affair itself. Valeria didn't just want the man, she wanted to inhabit the life Elena had built. One afternoon, Elena received a call from an administrative clerk at the shipyard named Nuria. She asked if Elena had authorized the official name change for the vessel. According to the original file, the yacht was named Aurora, but Alvaro's office had submitted a request to rename it Valeria. Nuria needed to confirm who would cover the additional registration and repainting fees. Elena feigned total awareness and requested the documentation. Though hesitant due to orders to deal only with executive management, Nuria forwarded the paperwork. The document contained a digital signature attributed to Elena, alongside a clause stating she waived all objections to the commercial name change. Elena pulled up her personal records and compared the signature. It was authentic, but it had been lifted from an authorization she signed 2 years earlier for a hotel renovation project. That evening, Elena waited for Alvaro in his home office. She set a printout of the order on his desk, covering the signature line. When he arrived, she asked directly if he was changing the name of the vessel. Alvaro removed his jacket calmly and replied that Valeria was simply a naming option suggested by marketing. Elena pointed out that naming a corporate asset after a staff member would trigger immediate rumors. He stepped closer and said the rumors already existed because she insisted on acting like a neglected wife, adding that Valeria represented youth, freedom, and ambition, the exact values the brand required. Elena asked what she represented. Alvaro hesitated before replying that she represented stability and the past, as if those words were a prison sentence. He then picked up the document, recognized the order, and claimed an assistant must have mixed up the files, promising to fix it while slipping the paper into his drawer instead of discarding it. The next day, Elena confirmed that her forged authorization remained attached to the bank file as part of a project update, meaning the lender believed she had vetted and approved the change. For the first time, Elena considered revoking her guarantee immediately. However, doing so without overwhelming legal proof could trigger an immediate default, endangering the company, innocent employees, and vendors. Alvaro had created a scenario where any move she made could be spun to frame her as the villain ruining the family business. She needed to establish precisely where the legitimate business ended and the fraudulent scheme began. Elena walked into the private banking division and met with Thomas Aguirre. She stated she was reviewing the obligations tied to her personal guarantee, making no mention of the affair or forged papers. Thomas pulled up the file and walked through the terms, but when he reached the recent updates, he paused. According to bank records, Elena had attended 2 virtual board meetings and formally approved a major operational lease structure. She asked for the dates. One corresponded to the exact day of her mother's surgery, and the other to a morning she was attending a public charity board meeting in another city. Thomas turned the screen toward her. The minutes stated that the guarantor had expressed full approval and answered questions regarding an external operator whose identity was hidden in an unreviewed annex. Elena maintained her composure and asked what would happen if the external operator was tied to someone inside executive management. Thomas explained that any such relationship had to be fully disclosed, especially if it reduced projected revenues or transferred effective control of the asset, adding that non-disclosure would trigger an immediate internal compliance review. Elena requested certified copies of every document bearing her signature, reminding him of her legal rights as guarantor. Thomas complied, but before she left, he asked quietly if there was reason for concern. Elena replied that she was not yet certain whether the bank was facing a simple administrative error or something much worse. That same afternoon, Nuria inadvertently sent Elena an internal schedule for the launch event. The itinerary featured a private celebration immediately following the public ceremony, including an intimate dinner for 20 guests and a symbolic key presentation to Valeria Cruz. In the notes section was a direct instruction from Alvaro. Ensure Mrs. Marquez does not remain on board after official press photos. Elena read the line repeatedly. He intended to use her presence to validate the project for the bank and media, only to immediately banish her from the very asset backed by her estate. Attached was a draft of Alvaro's planned speech. He spoke of a woman who had taught him to live without fear and start anew. The word wife did not appear once. When Alvaro returned home late that week, Elena suggested having dinner at the restaurant where they had celebrated their 10th anniversary. She wanted to see him away from corporate offices and home stress. During dinner, she brought up their early years, their shared sacrifices, and the promises they had made never to let success warp their values. Alvaro listened with clear impatience, saying that people evolve and that clinging to the past was a form of cowardice. Elena asked if he was in love with someone else. He didn't answer directly, stating instead that he needed someone capable of driving him forward, whereas Elena had chosen to anchor herself to hospitals, old memories, and family duties. The response laid bare his moral framework. Her devotion to her ailing mother was a flaw, while his betrayal was self-actualization. 2 days later, the formal invitation to the launch arrived in a thick envelope sealed with gold wax. The word Valeria was embossed above the ship's outline, and inside, a short bio described the communications director as the inspiration and godmother of the vessel. Elena was relegated to a secondary guest list alongside vendors and junior staff. Alvaro saw the open invitation on the counter and asked if she planned to attend. She said she would. Her calm demeanor seemed to disconcert him. He had clearly expected a hysterical scene he could use to justify his actions to others. He warned her that he would not tolerate awkward questions or emotional outbursts. Elena promised she would not interrupt the event without legitimate cause. Satisfied he had regained command, Alvaro smiled and said that after the launch, they could have a civilized conversation about their future, unaware that every word was being recorded on the phone hidden in her bag. That night, Elena spread every piece of evidence across her desk: bank statements, vendor invoices, shipyard orders, meeting minutes with copied signatures, and certified bank filings. The final missing piece was the direct legal connection between Valeria and the operating company. A deep dive into state corporate records brought up Mediterranean lifestyle charters, incorporated 3 months prior with minimum capital. Its registered agent was Valeria's older brother, and its primary business address matched an apartment owned by Valeria's close friend. Elena cross-referenced the name with the bank's unreviewed annex and found it listed as the exclusive external operator. The lease terms were absurdly low, granting priority access to its managers, while Ferrer Hospitality retained all debt obligations, insurance, maintenance, and crew salaries. The scheme was as simple as it was arrogant. Alvaro had counted on Elena never looking past the cover page. Elena printed the filings and called her attorney. Lucia listened in complete silence as Elena walked through the guarantee, the forged signatures, the shell company, and the launch plans. When Elena finished, Lucia bypassed all discussion of divorce or infidelity, stating flatly that they were looking at documentary forgery, corporate self-dealing, and financial fraud against a lending institution. She instructed Elena not to confront Alvaro, sign nothing else, and keep all original documents in a secure location outside her home. The next morning, Elena sat in Lucia Navarro's top-floor office overlooking the city park. Lucia laid out the documents, separating the evidence of infidelity from the corporate crimes. One ruined a marriage, the other could dismantle a company and result in criminal indictments. Over 3 hours, Lucia mapped out the mechanics of the fraud. The commercial loan had been granted to Ferrer Hospitality based on Elena's ironclad collateral, but through unauthorized annexes, effective control of the mega yacht was being handed over to an entity controlled by Valeria's family. Ferrer Hospitality would carry the heavy financial burden, while the shell company paid an annual fee lower than the cost of docking rights. Lucia highlighted a clause granting the shell company exclusive use of the vessel for 220 days a year. Lucia brought in Javier Montalban, a forensic IT specialist. Examination of the digital files revealed that the signature on the critical board approval document had not been generated during the recorded meeting. It was extracted from a PDF created 2 years earlier for a hotel project. The graphic retained original metadata and compression artifacts that did not match the rest of the page. Furthermore, the electronic certificate tied to Elena had never validated the transaction. Someone had simply pasted an image of her signature onto the page and exported it. Javier confirmed that while the document looked convincing to a casual viewer, it would fail any basic forensic audit. The second revelation was even worse. Bank logs claimed Elena had logged into 2 virtual authorization meetings, but IP tracking showed those connections originated directly from Alvaro's private office desktop. During one session, Elena's user account was active for only 4 minutes without enabling camera or microphone. Yet the recording secretary noted that the guarantor had expressed explicit approval. Javier traced the hardware ID to a corporate tablet, assigned to Beatriz Lobo, Alvaro's longtime personal executive assistant. Lucia noted the name. Elena had known Beatriz for years, a quiet, meticulous woman who managed calendars and gifts without question. They needed to secure the original email threads to confirm whether Beatrice was a willing accomplice or simply following orders. Nuria, the shipyard administrator, agreed to meet them at a quiet diner away from the harbor. She arrived visibly nervous, asking that her name be protected. She explained that orders regarding the yacht had shifted radically after Valeria's arrival. Initially, all cabins were designed for corporate guests, but the master suite was suddenly reconfigured into a lavish private residence. Valeria had visited the shipyard 6 times with Alvaro, openly referring to the vessel as our home on the water. Nuria also provided an email ordering the removal of corporate logos from interior spaces, replacing them with VC monograms, accompanied by an explicit directive. Mrs. Marquez is not to receive copies of these changes as her role is strictly limited to financial guarantor. Nuria handed over visitor logs and an audio message Valeria had sent to vendors, demanding that interior finishes be completed in time for her birthday. Crucially, Nuria produced an order signed by Alvaro, authorizing the shell company to hire crew and take reservations prior to official bank approval, proving a clear pre-existing intent to divert the asset. When they returned to the office, Elena remained silent for a long moment. Translating personal betrayal into dates, emails, and financial figures was far more painful than imagining it. Alvaro had systematically planned her replacement while she was sitting at her mother's hospital bedside. Lucia reminded her that the shame belonged entirely to the person who abused trust, not the person who granted it. Elena chose to give Alvaro one final chance to explain the discrepancies, not expecting a sudden confession, but wanting to hear how far he would lie when he believed she had no proof. That night, Alvaro entered the library at their estate and found Elena sitting near the fireplace with a closed folder on the table. She had hidden a small audio recorder among the books, maintaining her phone as a backup. She began by asking if Project Aurora was still serving its original commercial purpose. Alvaro replied without hesitation that it was, claiming no significant changes had occurred. Elena then asked who owned Mediterranean Lifestyle Charters. Alvaro paused before adopting his usual smooth tone, explaining it was an independent firm brought in to maximize booking efficiency. Elena pointed out that the company had been formed 3 months prior by Valeria's brother. Alvaro frowned, annoyed not by the discovery, but by her audacity to investigate, arguing that family connections did not invalidate good business opportunities. Before Elena could respond, the library door swung open. Valeria walked in holding a glass of wine, wearing one of Alvaro's silk shirts, completely unfazed to find Elena there. On her wrist sparkled an emerald bracelet that Elena recognized instantly, an anniversary gift from Alvaro that Elena had locked inside their home safe months earlier. Valeria raised her glass, commenting that financial meetings were always so dreary. Alvaro made no move to send her out. Elena realized her presence was a calculated power move. They wanted her to see how much ground she had lost and accept her defeat quietly. Elena asked directly if Valeria was the true beneficiary of the vessel. Alvaro claimed the ship belonged to Ferrer Hospitality and accused Elena of mixing personal insecurities with corporate structures she didn't understand. Valeria added that Elena should feel proud that her inheritance was enabling something beautiful instead of acting like a bitter accountant. Elena looked at Valeria and asked if she understood the financial risk hanging over her father's building. Valeria took a sip of wine and remarked that wealthy people always exaggerated the sentimental value of their real estate when they were afraid of losing control, proving she was fully aware of where the collateral came from. Alvaro stepped closer, his tone turning cold and threatening. He warned that her father's building was perfectly safe, as long as she didn't cause problems with the lender. If she tried to pull her guarantee, she would trigger an immediate liquidity crisis, destroy company value, and ruin hundreds of innocent employees, framing her options as a moral test. Trust him, or take responsibility for destroying the company. When Elena asked if that meant she had no right to oversee the project, despite bearing the entire financial risk, Alvaro stated flatly that she had signed the papers voluntarily, that her signature gave her no management authority, and that all decisions belonged to him alone. He added that Valeria operated under his direct authority, and that Elena lacked any power to stop the launch. He repeated the statement at her request, entirely convinced he was establishing his absolute dominance. Elena closed her folder, stood up, and gathered her coat. Before leaving, she looked at Alvaro and asked if he wanted to correct anything he had just said. He replied that he had nothing to correct, and reminded her that the future belonged to those bold enough to take it. As Elena stepped out into the night, her legs trembled. She walked into the garden and stood in the dark until she caught her breath, weeping not for Valeria or the stolen bracelet, but for the man who had weaponized the livelihoods of his own staff against his wife. She retrieved the hidden recorder after they went upstairs, packed a small bag, and drove to her mother's apartment. On the way, she listened to the playback, Alvaro's voice clearly declaring that all decisions were his, that Elena had no authority, and that Valeria was acting under his explicit instructions, words intended to crush her that had just become her ironclad defense against any corporate wrongdoing. The next morning, Thomas Aguirre reviewed the shell company filings, signature metadata, and fabricated meeting logs in a private bank conference room. He asked if Elena was prepared to formally testify that she had never authorized the asset transfer. She confirmed she was. Thomas immediately called the compliance department to freeze further disbursements, though he noted that because most of the funds had already been advanced to the shipyard, they needed to execute a quiet, precise legal strategy to prevent Alvaro from destroying records or attempting to move the vessel. Lucia filed an emergency motion with the commercial court to enjoin any transfer of ownership and freeze all corporate asset modifications. Forensic experts certified the forged signatures, while Nuria submitted internal emails in exchange for whistleblower protections. Meanwhile, Alvaro continued planning his grand celebration, entirely oblivious to the legal net closing around him. On the eve of the event, Elena placed copies of all evidence into her mother's safe, looking at the empty velvet box where her anniversary bracelet had once rested. She realized then that physical objects only held the value of the integrity behind them. When Port Authority officers sealed the gangway at Puerto Banús, the flashbulbs were blinding. Thomas Aguirre stood on the main stage, reading the formal suspension notice, while Alvaro tried frantically to snatch the document from his hands. Port officers blocked him, reminding him the vessel remained under shipyard custody. Guests abandoned their seats, pushing forward as dozens of phones captured the chaos. Alvaro turned toward the press and shouted that this was a bitter personal scheme by his wife to get revenge for an impending divorce. Valeria grabbed the microphone, tearfully claiming that the ship's name was a simple marketing idea and accusing Elena of threatening to destroy the business if Alvaro didn't return home. Elena walked calmly to the microphone and asked one question. Was Mediterranean Lifestyle Charters owned by Valeria's brother? The room went dead silent. Alvaro tried to claim the firm was an independent contractor, but Elena pressed further, asking if her brother was the sole manager of an entity set to receive over 200 days a year of private vessel use. Valeria froze. Lucia stepped up to the stage, handing copies of the corporate registry to members of the press and confirming the hidden contract options. Thomas ordered key documents projected onto the large presentation screen set up for the launch. The display showed the stark contrast between the original commercial proposal and the secret lease agreement. Ferrer Hospitality paid all debt, maintenance, and crew costs, while Valeria's family entity paid a nominal token fee. A board member shouted, asking why the agreement had never been presented to the board. Alvaro's brother claimed it was merely an unapproved draft, but Lucia immediately displayed Alvaro's signature alongside authorization orders issued prior to bank approval. Javier Montalban presented the forensic signature analysis on the big screen, showing the exact side-by-side compression match between the forged loan approval signature and Elena's signature from a 2-year-old hotel document. Next came the access logs for the virtual meetings Elena had supposedly attended, proving the logins originated from Alvaro's office computer, while Elena was miles away at a medical clinic. Pressed by reporters, Elena stated clearly that she was not making public accusations. She had submitted undeniable evidence to federal regulators and financial auditors to prevent her personal estate from being used to fund an illegal diversion of assets. Valeria seized the microphone again, screaming that she knew nothing about financial arrangements and that Alvaro had told her the lease was completely legal. Her voice cracked as Lucia displayed an email Valeria had sent to her brother, celebrating that once the final bank payout went through, Elena would be powerless to stop them. Another audio file played Valeria's voice, demanding custom cabin finishes for her birthday and ordering corporate logos removed. The very guests who had been drinking champagne minutes earlier pulled away from her. The woman on the bow was no longer an inspiring muse. She was an active accomplice to fraud. Alvaro turned on Valeria in a rage, asking why she had ever written those emails. The argument exploded directly into live microphones. Valeria shouted that Alvaro had promised her Elena would sign anything put in front of her, and that her building would absorb all the financial risk. Alvaro accused her of twisting private conversations, but Valeria shot back that she had only agreed to the plan because he promised a quick divorce and full control of the mega yacht after its first season. The board of directors convened an emergency session in a private marina conference room, barring Valeria from entering. Elena took her seat as a major shareholder alongside her legal counsel. The chief financial officer admitted he had processed several wire transfers based on direct orders from Alvaro, accompanied by what he assumed were valid approvals from Elena. Other directors confessed they had received incomplete reports. Alvaro attempted to argue that Elena had historically supported company projects and that her sudden intervention was an abuse of power. Lucia responded by playing the library recording, where Alvaro clearly stated that all decisions were his alone, that Valeria acted under his direct command, and that Elena had no authority whatsoever. The very statement he had used to intimidate his wife completely eliminated her liability while sealing his own. The board voted overwhelmingly to suspend Alvaro immediately as chief executive officer, stripping him of all executive credentials, corporate accounts, and company devices. When the board secretary removed his executive access card from the table, Alvaro glared at Elena with raw hatred, asking if she was happy now that she had ruined everything they built. Elena answered quietly that she had not ruined the company. She had stopped him from using it as his personal piggy bank, reminding him that hundreds of employees depended on the firm surviving his actions. Outside the room, Valeria was waiting. When she saw Alvaro emerge stripped of his title, she ran over demanding to know where they were staying that night and what would happen to the resort apartment, cars, and allowances he had promised. Alvaro snapped that he had bigger problems than her lifestyle. Valeria realized instantly that her corporate credit cards were about to be canceled, and that none of the luxury she had been enjoying was in her name. She publicly accused him of using her, while Alvaro countered that she was the one who insisted on putting her name on the ship. They traded bitter insults in front of lingering reporters until security escorted them in separate directions. The bank froze all remaining loan funds and issued a formal notice of default against the contract. The vessel was seized at the shipyard, slated to be resold to an international buyer under a different name. The gold letters spelling out Valeria were unbolted one by one, leaving nothing behind but faint outlines on the white paint. Alvaro was ousted from management, stripped of his corporate assets, and subjected to a comprehensive federal forensic audit. His assistant, Beatrice, agreed to cooperate with authorities, providing emails and internal directives, proving that Alvaro had instructed her to forge Elena's digital presence during loan meetings. Faced with overwhelming evidence of document forgery and financial fraud, Alvaro ultimately accepted a plea agreement. He avoided immediate state prison time by surrendering substantial personal assets, paying massive restitution fines, and accepting a multi-year ban from serving as an officer or director of any public or regulated entity. The man who had defined his entire identity through corporate dominance was left stripped of his authority, his reputation destroyed across the business community. Valeria's brother faced civil penalties for his role in the shell company, while Valeria was let go from the firm, evicted from corporate housing, and dropped by the high society circles she had worked so hard to enter. Elena refused to let bitterness dictate her future. She oversaw a complete restructuring of Ferrer Hospitality, installing independent oversight, double authorization protocols, and strict ethics protections to ensure no single executive could ever abuse corporate power again. Once the business was stabilized under professional management, she stepped back from daily operations. Her father's commercial building was fully released from all liens. She renovated 2 floors of the property to establish the Marquez Horizon Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing comprehensive financial literacy, legal protection, and executive mentorship to women entering business, ensuring no woman would ever sign away her rights out of misplaced trust or manufactured guilt. A year after the failed launch, Elena returned to the coast to watch the first graduating class of her foundation's maritime management program board a modest training vessel. There were no brass bands, no luxury champagne, and no golden names stamped on the hull. But every young woman on board wore a uniform featuring her own name. Elena stood at the end of the pier, watching the boat push smoothly out into the open water. She realized true dignity was never found in the size of a yacht, the sparkle of a stolen bracelet, or a name painted in gold across a hull. Real strength was the quiet, unyielding courage to stand up, tell the truth, and take back the wheel of your own life. Life has a quiet, unrelenting way of bringing us back to the contracts we sign, not just the legal documents we execute in sterile offices, but the unwritten agreements we make with ourselves, our partners, and the legacy we inherit. We live in a world that constantly glorifies the appearance of success, urging us to move fast, project power, and sacrifice quiet integrity for loud validation. It is easy to fall into the trap of believing that devotion means unquestioning silence, or that loving someone requires us to surrender our voice while they build monuments to their own ego. But true loyalty never asks you to participate in your own erasure. When we allow our trust to be mistaken for weakness, we do not just risk our material assets, we risk losing the very core of who we are. Elena Marquez's journey is not a story about revenge or the dramatic downfall of a dishonest spouse. It is a profound meditation on the moment a person decides that staying comfortable in a lie is far more dangerous than facing a painful truth. It serves as a reminder that staying silent to keep the peace is never real peace at all. It is merely a slow, quiet surrender. For anyone who has ever built a life alongside someone only to realize they were being slowly edited out of the narrative, the lesson is clear. Your worth is not defined by how much sacrifice you can endure, nor is your dignity an asset to be leveraged for someone else's ambition. Real power does not come from controlling others, hoarding status, or stamping your name onto expensive structures paid for with other people's sacrifices. Real power is the calm, unshakable clarity that comes when you refuse to allow your life to be written by anyone else. In the end, every grand display built on deception eventually breaks against the sharp reality of truth. The gold letters fade, the applause stops, and the crowd moves on. What remains is only the character we kept and the choices we made when no one was watching. Walking away from a toxic dynamic is never a defeat. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. It is the moment you reclaim your name, step off the stage built for your humiliation, and realize that the only life worth living is the one where you are the authentic author of your own story.